Yes, as that unmistakable music indicates, it is now time to reveal who the ETSU head football coaches could possibly be. I have compiled a short list, and yes, there could be an influence from John Gruden. I'll tell you more about that here in just a moment. Of course, that was the ETSU fight song that I once eloquently wrote about in Sports Talk magazine about 20 years ago, when Chip Kessler was still part of it. Okay, first of all, let's just reiterate, I don't think it's going to be anybody on the current staff. If it is somebody on the current staff, then I think that Scott Carter has some explaining to do, and for that matter, all the other powers that be, because why wouldn't you have just made him the head coach then and get on with the building of the program, especially when we are 9 days away from the early signing period for recruits? How many good recruits, and remember, they've already lost Jalen Adams to the Citadel here. How many good recruits are going to come into ETSU? Well, let me introduce to you to Carl Torbush. He won't be your coach. Let me introduce you over here to Mike O'Kane and Billy Taylor. He may or may not be your coach. Who are you going to bring in this, especially on a 4-year basis? And again, just to reiterate, if you joined us late, I do think that the early signing period, I think it's basically for the Big Five schools, Big Five conference schools, possibly some in the American, or you're trickling down to the Sun Belt, but it's the FBS schools. And what I think is that for the FCS, what their recruiting strategy, it's a changed game, is they look who has the early signings. We don't know how many people are really going to put that, ink to paper and be totally committed to the schools right now. But what you can do is to the people that haven't been early signings, let's say not the 4 and the 5 stars, but the 3 and the 2, and ETSU, or for that matter, Furman or, whoever, potentially Appalachian State can come in and say, look who they just signed early. You're not going to start if you go to that major school. You're not going to start if you go to Georgia or wherever in the SEC, the ACC, the Pac-12. But Austin Herrick's last year is this upcoming year here at ETSU, Mr. Quarterback. Tell you what, you let us redshirt you for a year, you'll have a chance to be a 4-year starter here at ETSU. And I think that is a real good way to do it. Now, again, who knows? ETSU may hire a coach tomorrow. Carter gave no indication how long it would take. It seemed, though, if he's taking several days just to plot a press conference that announces Carl Torbush's retirement, then how long is it going to take to find a football coach? My fear is too long. By the way, Carter will join us, he's penciled in, tomorrow on Tri-City Sports Now. But let's talk a little bit. First of all, if you are, who could be the ETSU coach? Let's get away from the funny lines like, Butch Jones is available. Yeah, so is Todd Graham. So is Kevin Sumlin. They're not coming. Come on. That's not happening. Let's get away from the small-mindedness of high school coaches. Let's get far away from that. By the way, name for me a college football program recently that has hired a high school coach and has been successful. And I'm going to keep it a football. I can name you some basketball programs that did so and they weren't successful. But, the only one that I can really remember is when Jerry Faust, it's going to be almost 38 years ago. Yeah, 38 years ago, went to Notre Dame, and that was a disaster. That was the beginning of Notre Dame falling from the elite. And although I know they won a national championship under Lou Holtz, should have been 2. How you cannot give them the national title in 93 is beyond me. But I would point out that it was just a disaster. You want to do that here? It's a different game. And then you'll get people, around here, they're just so small-minded. They won't even look at, say, if you were going to go that route, and I'm not remembering his name, but the innovative coach from Arkansas, who never punts. Wouldn't be giving that guy a shot. It'd be, I think we ought to give Mike Lunsford a chance. This isn't a knock on Mike Lunsford at Cloudland. He's a very good football coach. But if he wants to be a college coach, I think he would have had plenty of times to move to become an assistant by this time at some place and have the natural progression. You don't just have a coach from wherever in Northeast Tennessee or Southwest Virginia come aboard and then become a head coach right away. Anyway, this is Sports 101, and the fact that I have to explain it sometimes makes me wonder. But let's look at some of the guys that be out there throwing out. I don't think it'll be anybody on the current staff because of what I just said. I mean, why wouldn't you hire them already? It'd look really bad if you brought in someone from the current staff the way it's going now. And I hate that for a Billy Taylor or some of the other people on the staff, but it's just the way it now is played out. One name that came up that expressed some interest in the position, Donnie Abraham. He's now a defensive backs coach at Illinois. I would love it if they brought him in. Absolutely love it. I know that Illinois was 2-10 this year. You know what else Illinois was? You know who their head coach was? Lovie Smith. You know who their defensive coordinator was? Hardy Nickerson. Their tight ends coach was a guy named Bob Legashevsky, who also has a lot of pro experience. And, I mean, they've got an offensive line coach who is, it's Luke Butkus, Dick Butkus's nephew, for crying out loud. Most of the coaches there have a lot of pro experience. It's the Big Ten, after all. Here's what else. Abraham makes $220,000 a year as an assistant at Illinois. ETSU can match or even top that salary. They're going to pay Steve Forbes more than $400,000. That's a name. I realize coming in 2-10. He's a guy who also was coaching some high school, but it was at IMG Academy in Bradenton, which is the top high school if you're going to do this. He's also coached arena football. But the main thing here is there's one difference I'm going to make for you with the difference between high school coach from Science Hill and high school coach like Donnie Abraham, who has actually been a college coach. Admittedly a position coach at Illinois, and they didn't win this year, but he has been there. But additionally, not only the pro experience, but yes, the pro experience. The man intercepted more than 30 balls in the NFL. The man played for Tony Dungy. The man played for, who else did he? I mean, alongside Rondé Barber. The man played, did he play for Gruden? I'm trying to remember. Was he with the Jets at that time? Because the Jets, he might have been, it wouldn't have been Al Groh, I don't think, is who he would have been associated with. But anyway, I just, that pro experience, being around pro, would be invaluable to have that experience in an ETSU. Absolutely invaluable. So, I mean, that's a guy right there. A lot of people, speaking of people who have just come from a 1 year of being a college coach, George Quarles, offensive coordinator at Furman, of course, longtime winner at Maryville. Because Maryville didn't collapse when he left. Quarles also is a Furman grad. Nothing wrong with that. But are you going to lure an offensive coordinator from Furman away to go to ETSU? And 1 year as an assistant. There's a big difference that even at a state championship type team, even one where players play 4 years and they never lose a game, that you bring in that coach with 1 year of college ability experience. And Furman won. I mean, they had a massive resurrection. Let's give them credit for that. But there is a difference, 1 year off of Maryville, 1 year off of IMG Academy with NFL experience, and for that matter, with Big Ten experience instead of Southern Conference experience. There is a difference. But no, Quarles, people are talking about him, et cetera, et cetera. Chris Beatty, 1995 grad of ETSU, is being talked about. He's a receivers coach at Maryland. Used to be an assistant at Vanderbilt when they were winning. He's got a good reputation as a recruiter. They all have good reputations as a recruiter. By this time, whenever somebody, he's a great recruiter, I just sort of like, oh, that's nice to know. But, Who gets hired as a coach in college football without that? He's a great recruiter. Who doesn't have that? You know, whoever, is he a good recruiter? Nobody's handsome. I mean, you know, the great recruit's a nothing statement. But he has been a part of several successful college football programs, has Chris Beatty. Here's the one thing about an Abraham or a Beatty that I think might prevent them from getting the job, and I don't know, but I've talked about the ETSU culture. Things aren't good. They're 4-7. They regress from last year, but they do a press conference in which you would have thought that Carl Torbush was the greatest coach of all time. Everything at ETSU is sensational, even when it's bad. That's the way they are. Now, one of the exceptions maybe to that rule, but it also shows how insular. That statement of, even when, you know, we're dropping football, remedial conference, winning the right way, that shows a very insular, and I have felt it a lot as a member of the media, even to this day, where I don't propagandize for ETSU, and so they resent it. Big time. But if I tell the truth, they don't like it. Now, kind of an insular, not a kind of, it is an insular mentality they have at ETSU Athletics. When I remember covering ETSU Athletics, and more than one person behind the scenes used to say how much they didn't like Mike Cavan. That's surprising. Even some of his own assistants, who I worked with at the BFFF, weren't fans of Mike Cavan. Yet here is the coach who had arguably the greatest season in ETSU history in 96. I think most people would say Grantland Rice Bowl of 69, but certainly the only 10 victory season since the Grantland Rice Bowl team of 1969. It was the best team since then. Best team of the last roughly a half century. Cavan put it forth. He brought he coached Donnie Abraham to be a pro. He made it possible for ETSU to win. Maybe that's one of the reasons inside where they kind of resent that. I don't know, football, well, the more successful it is, the more that takes away from other sports. It's a mentality that was around at ETSU. Why else would they have hired a tennis coach to be their athletic director in days of yore? The problem, and I don't think it is a problem at all, but it may prevent them from getting the jobs that they want. Chris Beatty and Donnie Abraham both played for Mike Cavan. They are part of that era. Now, I don't know why you would hold that against them. But I also used to hear things like, we don't like Mike Cavan. The amount of thugs that he brought into this university. Let me just say this here. This past year, you want to talk about thugs in a university, or you want to talk about Carl Torbush, you just spent millions of, a long time praising. I mean a long time on Friday. Had 2 assistant coaches arrested, and of course they're the famous 2 ball players that were arrested for stiffing a cab driver. Dismissed the leading tackler on the team last year, reason not given. You want to blame Cavan? And you want to tell me that Carl Torbush is clean as the pure driven snow? Just, and I will also tell you that I do believe that that Torbush's assistants will speak much higher of him than Mike Cavan. By the way, we had Mike Cavan on the show a while back, and there were some things that, he was supposed to call in, and he didn't, so we rescheduled. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, you're Mike Cavan, I'll do that. But he had actually said he hadn't been back to Johnson City in years, like a decade. So now works in the Georgia Athletic Department. And, so there is some feeling of hostility there to the Cavan situation. Would that prevent an Abraham or a Beatty from getting the job? Possibly. Be a bad thing if that did happen, but it could be. I was looking at some of the top assistants throughout the FCS. By the way, I really think Chattanooga did screw up, even though he lost a couple of good assistants to pro football, by naming Tom Arth the coach. And if ETSU goes that way, I think that they will suffer a similar fate as Chattanooga did, where they went from national rankings to 3-8 this past year. Arth isn't a recruiter. He'd always been at D3, coached at John Carroll before. Successful there. Maybe he'll grow into being a recruiter. But, well, maybe there is something, after all, to be said for he's a great recruiter, you know. But that was, I don't know, going from D3 to FCS is a huge leap, and it's one that I would not make the hire of head coach to head coach. I could see hiring, you know, well, let's hire this guy as an assistant, like a George Quarles was hired at Furman. I could see that, sure, that's the way you move up. But there's a natural progression. You don't go from your school play to feature films. Anyway, Marcus Satterfield will be named. He's a former ETSU player, played on that 96 team. His father was a successful coach at Greenback High, yes, 1A for many years. However, he comes in off of a bad year. He comes off of being fired. If you're going to hire old Tennessee Tech guys, why don't you go the loyalty route with Billy Taylor? Not that I'm against Marcus Satterfield. I kind of would like, you know, what if Satterfield came back as an assistant? He was the offensive coordinator, by the way, at Temple before he got the Tennessee Tech job, was Satterfield, and did a great job there. Remember a few years ago when Temple beat Penn State for the first time since 41? Yeah, he was the offensive coordinator there. Yeah, Temple used to be the worst college football program in America. Now they're rather competitive in the American. He had a part to do with that. So one could do worse. It's just that his stock is down. Anyway, so that's why I don't think it'll be Satterfield, but maybe you talk about him. Maybe you give him an interview. One guy who's working in college football right now, Big South Conference, has ETSU ties, has many local ties. Zane Vance used to be the head coach at Unicoi County, then went to be an assistant for Graham Clark at Dobbins-Bennett. He's also been an assistant, even a defense coordinator at 2 FBS schools, admittedly losing ones, in Kent State and New Mexico State. Now he's at Charleston Southern and is the defensive coordinator there. Unfortunately, the Buccaneers, that's what they call Charleston Southern, finished 6-5 this year. Well, that's not a bad record, you might say. Yes, but it's a regression from what they had experienced before. Still a man with FBS experience and local ties. ETSU grad. Problem with Vance, a super person, probably a little bit, shall we say, probably a little bit too much of a loser. And I don't mean that he's a losing, you know, his record, there's a lot of losses on it. Kent State and New Mexico State don't win, folks. I guess New Mexico State this year is going to a bowl, but, you know, there's a reason why Kent State hasn't won the MAC since Jack Lambert played for him, okay? Not even James Harrison could save Kent State. A couple of guys who are assistants in the Southern Conference I think that they ought to look at would be Clayton Carlin, who's the offensive coordinator of Sam Houston State. I started looking at the various assistants, the coordinators at the Final Four of FCS, and his was the resume that really struck me. A couple of guys from the Dakota schools, they're just not, you just looked at them and it was like, no, you're too Dakota. I mean, you just had to see these guys. It's like, you know, there is no way you should step out of North Dakota. Okay? I mean, let me explain something to you. East Tennessee is all white. It's like 97% white, the Tri-Cities are. I looked at some of the coach, I hate to put it this way, but these guys look like Ned Flanders that were the offensive coordinators at North Dakota State and South Dakota and all that. They're very good coaches, don't get me wrong, but I don't know if they would fit outside of the Dakotas. Still, Texas isn't the Dakotas. Sam Houston State guy named Clayton Carlin, offensive coordinator there. Young guy, might be willing to look at him. Another guy that I liked who is, looking inside the Southern Conference. A guy named Russ Callaway. He's the offensive coordinator at Alabama, at Samford. At Samford, he used to be a coach at Alabama. He was an assistant to Kirby Smart, and Smart was a defensive coordinator there. He was a former quarterback at Valdosta State. Remember where Mike Cavan came from? Yeah, Valdosta State. And he comes from a coaching family. About 29 years old, really young, but I kind of like that. Look what happened to Samford this year. They went from losing to ETSU in a 7-4 record to nearly, not only trouncing ETSU, but going back to the FCS playoffs, where they lost to Kennesaw State, of all people. So Russ Callaway, the offensive coordinator at Samford, I think could be somebody that would be worth a look in conference, young up-and-comer, etc. Like I said, coached alongside Kirby Smart. How bad can he be? I'm going to tell you a guy that they ought to look at big time. This should be on their list. His name is Pete Golding. He is the defensive coordinator at Texas San Antonio. Nobody is recruiting the Upper East Tennessee area better than Pete Golding. About 10 years ago, Pete Golding was at Tusculum. Tusculum. Advanced since then from those low levels to Texas San Antonio, FBS, albeit not in the Major 5. The amount of recruits, go on the rival site, find out who's being recruited by where. Golden has his tentacles on every good player, every potential college prospect in the upper Northeast Tennessee area. He has the local ties. And after being at Texas and Texas San Antonio, you got to think that maybe he just might have made some ties with high school coaches down there in the fertile Texas recruiting grounds. Pete Golding is a name that Scott Carter should absolutely be interviewing. He would bring in talent to ETSU, and dare I say, better talent than I believe what Carl Torbush would have brought in if he had continued on. I really believe that. Now, the name that why John Gruden might influence this coaching search. There is a report out. Yes, another John Gruden rumor. There is a report out that John Gruden might be a candidate to coach the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That makes sense. Still got a home there. ESPN is laying everybody off. And supposedly the head coach there, Dirk Cotter and Jameis Winston are not getting along. Cotter's only 13-16. The Buccaneers regressed this year. The idea of bringing Gruden back into the fold would be certainly a popular one. And, of course, he is very good at working with quarterbacks, and they have Jameis Winston down there. Something to look at. But if that happens, then what happens to Mike Smith? I would imagine that Mike Smith, defensive coordinator of the Buccaneers, might, on what a defensive coordinator makes, and I couldn't find a listing for a salary online, but a defensive coordinator, just think about this. The top coordinators in the SEC are making more than $1 million a year, so a defensive coordinator for the NFL, yeah, that's out of ETSU's price range. I get that. But what if he doesn't have a job? Older coach. Yeah, he was very successful as a head coach at Atlanta until the very end. But would another team just absolutely have to have him as a defensive coordinator somewhere? Maybe not. The problem with Smith, a little bit older, when you're going to an ETSU, you're going there to kind of retire. And so you wonder a little bit how effective. You're not paid quite as much. You wonder if you still have that same oomph. In other words, you're not Phil Fulmer 1993, 1998. You're Phil Fulmer 2005, 2008. That could be Mike Smith. Then again, the buzz that would create, he did help bring football back to ETSU when Smith was, was giving talks to the BFFF. Mike Smith, yeah, he would be on the second half of his career, but if he was interested, he'd be the biggest name hire in the Southern Conference without question. And it would be, although a shorter tenure, for that matter, how long has an ETSU football coach really lasted? Ever. That's how John Gruden might return a coach to ETSU. Tell me what you think. Tri-City Sports Now. Quick segment when we come back, and then Steve Forbes after this.